Hello and welcome to episode 12 of the Rain Check podcast about Edmund Ironside. I'm Austin,
And I'm Donna.
and this episode will cover a lot of the same bases as the last 2 weeks because Edmund is the son of Ethelred the Unready, and he rules right after Sven Forkbeard from last week, who only ruled for 5 weeks, and then Edmund, spoilers, is not going to rule for very long himself, but he was technically King of England. We're going to get into it, but
And I will just point out that he wasn't the eldest son of Athelred the Unready. He was third son. Athelred had a ton of sons, but the first two sons
yeah,
died.
I do have that here. So he was named after his great grandfather, Edmund the First, who I think that was the one that got stabbed in the fight.
Wasn't he
Right.
Edmund the Martyr? No.
Edmund the First. I
I
don't
kind of
know.
have a bit of a crush on Edmund because,
Yes, he was. He was. Sorry, he was the one that was killed at the brawl in Puckle
right, which he was a good guy, right? He died trying to defend someone and help people.
Yeah, he seemed decent.
He was a good namesake. But
Yeah, and then. Mhm.
in the Patricia Bracewell trilogy, which everyone should go out and read because it's so good. And
Yeah.
it's mostly about Emma. The Shadow on the Crown is book one, and that's where Edmund is. And then The Price of Blood and Still Beneath the Silk. They're all about Emma of Normandy by Patricia Bracewell, and they're very, very well written. And she wonders if maybe Emma and Edmund had a bit of a crush on one another because they were the same age. So, anyway, I've always kind of thought Edmund was a good guy.
Shipping Edmund and Emma. So yeah, he was the third of the six sons of King Ethelred and his first wife, Elfgifu, who was probably the daughter of Earl Thorid of Northumbria. So his elder brothers were named Ethelstan and Egbert, and his younger brothers were Edred, Edwig, and Edgar. So a lot of the names we've heard before. He had four sisters, Edgith, which is also known as Edith, Elfgifu, Wulfhilda, and the last one's just called the Abbess of Warewell Abbey, which is a weird name. I don't know. They must have
That
more
the
names.
girl before Wolf Fethru or something. That's seems like such an odd name these days, huh?
Wulfhilda. You
Wolfhilda,
wouldn't name
right?
your daughter Wulfhilda.
No, probably not.
So basically, um, so we had kind of talked about this, but after the Battle of Malden, where the English have a significant loss, so this is going back to 993 when Edmund's probably only, I think he was born around now, so he's like two or three. But um, after this, he summons a council at Winchester and admits to wrongdoing and setting out to correct his supposed errors. And this is when he promotes the cult of Edward the Martyr, who his his mom had killed probably.
Rumor
And
has it, right?
so he's kind of atoning for his sins. But then what's interesting to me is that he does that, but then this is well before he flees England, and then Sven takes over. Then Sven dies. Ethelred comes back, and the English are like, "Now you really have to promise that you're going to do better." So he had already done it once. It's like, "Fool me twice. Shame on you." I don't know, but then, as you know, so then Ethelred dies immediately. Well, actually, before we get there,
Not immediately.
not immediately, sorry, but yeah, I'm jumping ahead a little bit. But in 1015, when Edmund Ironside is about 15, he defies his father by marrying the widow of a Danish nobleman without his father's permission. So he's
Yeah, but let's explain why he did
tell me,
that.
yeah, because I didn't, yeah, tell us about that.
Okay, so in 1015, Edmund had two close allies. They were Thanes, which are like later on called earls.
I think it's
Um,
Thane.
Thanes, Sigfrith and Morcar, and they were super powerful people, and they were kind of friends with Edmund.
Hmm.
And one day they got invited to an assembly at Oxford by Edric Striona, who was an advisor to Athelred.
Hmm.
And side note, Edric Striona was later voted by BBC as the worst Englishman in the 11th century. So he was not a good guy. But
Yeah, we'll figure
he
out why
was
that
in he was an elderman to Athelred. So anyway, he said, "Hey, Siegfried and Morcar, I need you here for this assembly. We got to talk some business." So they came, and Striona had them murdered, and then he took Siegfried's wife and imprisoned her. And I don't know, it's a little. It says imprisoned her, but also I think she was in a monastery. So forced her into a monastery, and
is.
um
Why?
Edmund, well, Edmund took that as an action of his father against him because he thought, well, my father thinks I'm getting too powerful because I've got these two powerful thanes on my side.
Yeah,
And he wanted to bring his son Edmund down to size, basically. And so
sure.
Edmund took it as a direct affront to him. And so, in defiance of his father, he went and took Siegfried's wife, the one that had been imprisoned, and forced her to marry him. So,
Interesting.
and it was both as a retaliation against
Hmm.
what um, the
His
bad guy
father.
had done,
Hmm.
and also because it gave him again some power in the Danelaw areas because that's where she had her power base. So it was really a political move.
And I guess, yeah, like the dad, it could have been partially to damage his son's power, but also he was really, he did, he did that massacre on Saint Bryce's Day where he killed some Danes. So it could have been part of that type of thing of just like trying to reduce the power of the Danes.
Right. And but by doing this marriage and getting that payback, Edmund apparently won the allegiance of the five boroughs,
Right.
um, which was in the Daneland heartland. So yeah, so
Yeah.
Edmund was starting to get support from the Danelaw law area.
Danelaw, yeah. Yeah, one thing it seems to me, so this is, I guess, a painting of Edmund. Based on his name, Edmund, so we got Edmund Ironside versus his father, Ethelred the Unready. You can kind of guess which one was more well respected. And apparently, Edmund, like we had talked about how Ethelred was you could say pacifist or just, not really a fighter, not really an athlete, maybe. Um, didn't like to fight, whereas Edmund seems to be like kind of a more traditional like king who's really physically strong and a good warrior and good tactician. But
Right. I
unfortunately, so
think
there
the
were, well,
I
we're gonna
think
say,
the Ironside comes from his bravery, and it
yeah.
was a nickname that was given to him by his contemporaries. So it
Hmm.
shows that they really did feel like he was brave in battle.
It seemed like they had like they obviously didn't do that well in battles, but they were, I think, outnumbered pretty often. And just he was kind of, fighting battles all over the country. And his dad had left the country in a really bad spot. And he manages to actually, I mean, kind of get everything back together pretty well. It's just that he dies, just like everyone seems to be doing in this time period. He just dies immediately upon becoming king. So, but
Well,
a lot
in
of people
this,
think if he had been able to rule for even like 5 or 10 years, that he would have been a good king.
I think that's right. In the 7 months that he reigned, so he didn't even make it for but 7 months,
Hmm.
even less than his namesake Edmund the Martyr. He fought at least four and possibly six battles against Canute, and
Yeah.
he won several of them. So they were, it wasn't like he just kept losing and losing. He was winning some, Canute was winning some, and they just were on such an even basis that
Hmm.
Canute and Edmund decided, you know what, let's just reach an agreement rather than continuing to fight each other. And so they divided the country between themselves, whereas Canute got the Danelaw area and Edmund got Wessex.
So apparently they divided it on this line, Watling Street, which seemed weird. I was like,
Mm,
wait, how would they divide it on Watling Street? That seems like just a random street in London or something, but
hmm
it actually it probably
It
does
is a
go
street in
through London.
London, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, but it's pretty cool that it is essentially splitting England in half, but it's splitting it on a diagonal line. So it's sort of like Canute would have had the northeast and Edmund got the southwest.
It must have
Uh,
been an old Roman road, huh? Although it doesn't
it
look that
was,
straight.
yeah. That's I didn't look a ton into it, but yeah, it was a Roman road and like a trade route. Um, And yeah, real quick, I just wanted to say before that, it was interesting because when you kind of skim his life story, it's like he was born, he married the widow, but then when Canute invades, he helps his father like fight him back. But it's a little more complicated where not only did he go against his father by marrying the widow, but he actually was fully leading a rebellion against his dad. Like he wanted to rule instead of his dad, and so then it got a little bit complicated when Canute invades. So then he basically gives up his rebellion and is like, "Okay, I'm not going to rebel against my father right now because we got to first get rid of the Vikings." And then his father dies, so it kind of is a moot point. But um, it's interesting because yeah, I feel like we haven't heard that often where a son has fully rebelled against his father and like fought battles, had like a civil war to try to
Hmm
take over the throne. Usually it's more like behind the scenes politicking.
But we will.
We will, yeah. I think that's the thing is yeah, I don't know. It feels like people are getting savvier. Like before now, it seems like becoming king was more about who was just a better warrior and you just kind of like brute force, like take control. But I think in the next couple centuries, it's going to get more about like poisoning people and we're like who's your ally on the court and all that kind of stuff. So anyway, yeah, the battles, as we said, there were like five or six, and I was just gonna list off the battles here. So basically, so Canute is the son of Sven, and he first in 1013 lands at Sandwich in August of 1013, and he heads northwards, and that's when he receives the submission of the English north of Watling Street, like we said. Then he goes south of Watling Street, at which point his men did the greatest damage that any army could do, is what it said in the Chronicle. And so then he attacks London, but they are able to hold him off there. And I think that's when Ethelred and Thutmose the Tall or something is like it ends up helping out Ethelred.
I
He
think Emma was, some people say Emma was in London at that time too, helping to defend
Hmm.
the city.
And then Canute backs off of London, but is able to secure the rest of Wessex. And so then it's ice. So London's isolated, so they surrender. Ethelred flees for Normandy with his family, but then he leaves his two eldest sons, Edmund and Ethelstan, in England. And then I don't know what would have happened if Sven hadn't immediately died. Like, I don't know how safe they would have been, but he does die. And basically, his supporters, more in the Northeast, support Canute as king, but then they don't really know him. He's only been around for a little bit, and he's I think still pretty young, so they're not super excited about it. They had been more happy with Sven, when Sven had been ruling. So this is when Ethelred returns to England. Apparently, it's around Lent, the time period, and um, raises an army from London, and then he attacks Canute in April, and Canute is actually quickly defeated, and he flees to Denmark. So, yeah, that's basically we hadn't really covered that last episode because we had just sort of covered Sven, but after he dies, that's what goes on. So Ethelred technically rules for a little bit longer, maybe like a year and a half, and then he
Yeah.
dies April 23rd, 1016. And this is when Edmund takes the throne. And the four confirmed battles that he fought with Canute. So
Well,
the Canute comes back in
I'll
the
just
four
say that
battles.
Emma was in a precarious position because now her
Mhm.
husband is dead, and she has two sons with Ethelred, Edmund and Arthur, but they're younger than the four remaining sons from the first wife. So she's in
Mm.
a really precarious position. And like I said, she may have helped defend London, but she spent a lot of the time after Ethelred died back in Normandy with her two sons.
Yeah, I found this picture, which is technically Anglo-Normans, so we're not here yet, but um, I think it is nice to get a picture of kind of this is what people would be dressing like, at least soon. They soon will be like this. And I like this other one too. I think this is probably more like what regular people look like. Anyway, yeah, the four battles were Pencilwood, Shurston, Brentford, and then Otford. Um,
Which four battles?
I think those were the first four battles that Edmund is fighting against Canute when Canute comes back and they're fighting.
Okay, because do you have something about the Battle of Assendon?
Yeah, so then I was just about to say so it says he battles Canute at the Battle of Assendun. He was backed by the whole English nation, so he'd been building up power because I think he actually did pretty good at these other four battles, and then so he's
Edmund, we're
getting more
talking
and more
about.
support. But then tell us about Edric Striona, which sounds weirdly Italian.
It
Striona.
does, doesn't it? Yeah,
Hmm.
so at the Battle of Assendun, when Edmund had Canute on the back foot and was about to have victory, um, but of course, Edric Striona, who was a very powerful ealdorman, had a bunch of the forces that were helping fight on Edmund's side. And then all of a sudden, he switched sides and went over to Canute's side.
Why
And
do you think he
so
did that?
I don't know. Maybe because maybe because he knew Edmund would always hold a grudge against him because of the way he had killed Edmund's two biggest supporters
And I
and
had seen
imprisoned.
some.
Yeah,
I think it's
go
something
ahead.
about that, and then I had seen something where Edric had done, I think, several invasions of Wales. So I don't think the Welsh liked him. So he probably just wasn't very likable, and like, or a lot of the people here just didn't like him. So he just was
Well, he
like,
was the
screw it,
worst
and
Briton
joined
of the
Canute.
11th century.
Yeah. So I'm sure there was a lot of kind of like interpersonal drama that we just like no one wrote down, so we don't really know.
I
But
guess my question is, why did Edmund trust him in the first place? But maybe Striona just had so
had
much
power.
power and so
Yeah.
many people that Edmund couldn't afford to ignore him.
It's weird. Yeah, I don't know. It almost feels like I can't decide if it almost feels like people like switch sides more often back then. Like it was less of a big deal because it seems like it happens a lot. Where I had said like Thorkel the Tall, he had literally been invade. He was a Viking who was invading England, and then all of a
Hmm.
sudden he switches over and joins Edmund and helps him like in the siege of London. So maybe it's just more about like, well, hey,
Yeah.
I'm going to give you some money if you join my side, and people were just more practical back then, and we're like, okay, fine. Like,
Yeah. I don't know. I'm just don't have any evidence for this. I'm just going on logic. But to me, he's like, okay, like if Edmund becomes king of all of England and he has all the power, he's never going to really let me maintain all of my power because I've done him wrong too many times. But also, it reminds me of Richard, I think it's Richard the Third. I think that's who it is. During the War of the Roses, that was fighting against Henry the Sixth son, and he was looking like he might win the battle, and then but he was really relying on this one man that had sworn loyalty to him, and then that man ended up he didn't so obviously switch as Edric did, but
mhm.
he was supposed to be coming in as a reinforcement, and he just chose not to. So yeah, some people are not very trustworthy.
But it's also one of those things where it's like almost like England was just destined to be ruled by the Normans because there's been so many things like the dominoes have been laid out in such a way that it like keeps leading towards it where we've talked about like, oh, if this hadn't happened, if Ethelred had ruled better and hadn't paid off the Vikings, then none of this would have happened. And then even getting all the way to this part, all of this that we've already talked about could have happened. But then if Edric Striona hadn't betrayed him, then and Edmund had won the battle. I mean, I guess he
Hmm.
gets killed anyway, but if let's say he had like killed Canute or something, because I they basically think that Edmund was probably killed by Canute, not himself, but like by one of
On
his
Canute's
men, like
orders.
which I'll get
Yeah.
into in a second. But yeah, it's like basically if Edmund had just won and then kept ruling for even like 5 or 10 years, then you know maybe it
He
would
had a
still be
couple of sons
Anglo-Saxon
that could
king.
have, yeah, because he had sons that could have ruled after him as well.
But it's just like any time that it almost fixes itself and it's like, all right, we're back to Anglo-Saxons, then something weird happens and it gets thrown off again. But
Hmm.
anyway, so basically, after that happens, the Battle of Assunden, there might have been a sixth battle, we're not sure, but Edmund had to partition the kingdom at Alney with Canute receiving and everything except for Wessex held by Edmund. So basically, Edmund was left with only Wessex. He was essentially back
Did that
to,
include London, though?
I think
I
so.
think so. I think London was pretty loyal to
Well,
Edmund, but
I don't know because Wessex is pretty far away from
hmm, I
London,
don't
but
know.
I'm not an expert. But it doesn't really matter because, as I said, he Edmund dies suddenly in Oxford on November 30th, 1016, aged only about 26 or 27. He'd only been king for 7 months, and his death was extremely suspicious. The chronicle accounts suggest he was assassinated. One popular legend was that he was murdered, not in a very classy or way you would want to go out. He was murdered on the toilet by an assassin hiding in the cesspit who stabbed him from below, which one of the
Or
worst
someone
ways to
says by a
die.
crossbow hidden in the pit and rigged to fire when the king
Mm,
sat down. But
wow.
it's also he could have died from injuries sustained in some of these battles. So nobody knows, but I certainly wouldn't be surprised if Canute hadn't had him killed. Or Edric
Yeah.
Striona.
Yeah. Well, I want to look into that now because now that so Canute does take over since Edmund dies.
Right.
But I
And
wonder how
remember that
Edric does. Like, I wonder if Edric does end up getting a good amount of power now.
I think he probably does, but we'll have to research that and report back next week when we talk about
Yeah.
Canute's rule. But
Yeah.
Canute, so now Canute is the sole king, and
Mhm.
meanwhile, Edmund has a wife and two boys. So Canute exiled, we don't know what happened to the wife. Canute exiled the sons, and rumor has it that he had ordered whoever was supposed to take the sons into exile to actually murder them, but like make
Mhm.
it look like an accident, which is another reason to suspect he also had Edmund murdered. Um,
Mhm.
but I think it was a Dane that was supposed to do it, and they refused to do it. And so the sons actually did escape to Hungary,
Right.
and one of them died, I think, of illness or natural causes. But the other one married and had children, and we'll hear about them later, but spent their
Yeah.
life in Hungary.
Edward the Exile.
Hmm.
And his son becomes Edgar Atheling. So yeah, we will hear about them. But that's one thing that'll be kind of nice is we're all the way back in 1016 and Canute's gonna rule until 1066, right? Basically. So it's gonna be he actually rules for like 50 years after all this chaos. It's like, all right,
And
now we have a Viking for
wait,
50 years.
who else is ruling during that time?
I'm assuming Emma of Normandy. I don't
Emma!
know. Okay.
Because Canute's like, what is, Emma's like, what am I gonna do now? I'm screwed.
Mm,
And whether she positions herself well or Canute thinks politically she would be a good match or some combination of the two, he proposes to her and they get married. And they are married during his entire reign and she outlives Canute. So she has
I
been
mean,
ruling as queen longer,
I see why she has a whole trilogy written about her because that is an insane life. She's married. That's a lot of kings to be married to.
right? And to have William the Conqueror as your great nephew and
Yeah,
to take refuge at some points with Baldwin of Flanders. Anyway, we'll get into
I
that
think
in a
that is
little bit.
something that is kind of unique about women in this time is like people like Emma, where they're like jumping around to these totally different courts and they get to see like all the sides of it. They get to see what it's like in Normandy and England and like the Danish court. Whereas I feel like for
Hmm.
guys, it's kind of like, okay, like you're not really going to move to your wife's court, probably. I guess that would happen sometimes, but I don't think they're getting to see as many sides.
Hmm.
You know what I mean? Um, Yeah. So anyway, the thing I said, as I said before, reflecting on Edmund, it seems like some people basically say he was everything his father wasn't. He was brave, energetic, militarily competent, inspiring, but he just only had 7 months to actually prove it. But um, how would you rate? It's hard. It's kind of really hard to rate Edmund, but I would give him maybe
I
like
rate him
a
pretty
pretty
highly.
high, like an 8 out of 10.
I think so because he was a good soldier and leader. He demanded respect. He was called brave, by his peers.
Hmm.
And yeah, I mean, if he hadn't had the misfortune of being alive at the same time as Edric Striona, who was an asshole, yeah, I think he would have been good. Of course, we don't really know that much about how he would have ruled because he mostly was fighting. But I think he showed that he was pretty politically savvy and he was aggressive, which was a good thing for and could he wasn't afraid to act when he needed to, like taking that widow and marrying her because it was politically advantageous, so I think he would have done
Yeah.
well, and I think an 8 is a good grade for him.
I think he's a good example of that whole idiom or whatever that's like bad times create great men and great men create good times and good times create weak men or whatever. So it's sort of like his dad had kind of messed things up, created bad times. So then he's raised in this crazy fighting chaos. So he just becomes more of a fighter, whereas his dad maybe was born into a more stable situation. So he just wanted to chill more.
Well, and I think, back to Athelred, I do think he was haunted. He was put into a bad position by his mom and others, because he was, I think, only 8 when
Mm-hmm.
his brother was murdered, and he was technically, to rule, although his mother ruled as regent for him. But I think he really did live with a big sense of guilt that wasn't his fault. And as we've talked about
Yeah.
before, some of the circumstances as to why the Vikings were beginning their raids again on England weren't Ethelred's fault. So, yeah, I mean, I think Ethelred maybe didn't get dealt the best hand either, but I also
Mm-hmm.
don't think he had the personality to be a good ruler in any
Sometimes you get
circumstance.
dealt a bad hand and you kind of don't do well, and sometimes you get dealt a bad hand and you're able to turn it around and you're kind of like
Isn't that
amazing.
the truth? Isn't that the truth? You can feel really sorry for people because, I don't know, they had drug abused parents and, whatever. Like they had these really sad sob stories, and
Uh-huh.
they took that and they create, this wonderful life. And then
Hmm.
other people you hear
Not
about
everyone.
some, that they were not successful, but you can, you're like, well, of course, look at the situation they were in. And
Yeah.
it's just, it's just such a weird combination of things, you know? It's both the
Mhm.
situation you're in and things, some things that are just innate within you, and then just
Right.
random luck. And as we talked about last time, the climate of the time that you're in, you know, there's just so many
Sometimes you
random
just even,
things.
yeah, like just watch like a really good movie or a book or something, and then it inspires you to like go do something. And
Right.
no, it's crazy. I do think about that a lot, where it's just I watch so many documentaries about directors and everything, and they're sort of like, yeah, if I hadn't done this, I'm not really good at anything else. I don't know what I would have done. And it's kind of like I just think about all the people that don't become directors, and it's just like, well,
Right. It's just really like Sarah Blakely always says, you know, it's good to fail because if you're not failing, you're not trying, and you got to
yeah,
try.
yeah. Well, that's been our philosophy segment. I just
That's why we're doing our podcast.
true, yeah, we're gonna become professional podcasters. So I did want to end just because I had already looked these up and just to kind of, I'm trying to show more pictures of what, I mean, this is more like nobility a lot, but this shows sort of what the regular people would have looked like at the
Mm-hmm.
time. And because I think it's interesting to reflect, like talk about what things are like now, and then maybe in a couple centuries, like what's different. But around now, it says that slavery was pretty normalized. I guess Bristol was
Which we don't
enacted.
really think about, right?
Yeah, and obviously it was, different than how we sort of maybe think of slavery, like, but yeah, there were bond servants, and they were kind of the underpinning of the whole economy. Like it sort of ran on slavery, and it actually props to William because it does say that after the Norman conquest, feudalism gradually replaces this system. So I mean, feudalism isn't great. You're still bound to your baron, your local baron, and all that. But I think life is better than being a bond servant. I believe slightly, marginally better. Um, that's one thing. And then honey was, I don't know. It says here a form of currency, but I think essentially it's just saying that it was very valuable because there's no sugar. They don't have sugar cane or anything. So honey is the only sweetener, and so it was so valued that it kind of became a form of currency. And they also used it to brew mead, which was the most common alcoholic drink. And I have to say, mead is not as good as beer. Maybe I just haven't had the best mead, but it's a little bit too sweet for me, but not bad. And the last one is that people were mostly illiterate. So we'd kind of mentioned this before, where that's one reason why like tapestries and more visual symbols were important than books, because just basically no one could read. Like 99% of people could not read unless you're a priest. So, yeah, it's interesting to think about because obviously now English is uh, very much a written language that a lot of people understand. But back then, I mean, they understand the language, but weren't writing or reading. And that's all the fun facts for today about the year 1000 in England. Next week, it will be Canute. Does Canute have, is it like Canute the Great or anything?
Mm. I'm not sure. I
What is
think
he?
he did have a name like that, but I can't swear to it. So we'll have to confirm
Yeah,
that
he
for
does. He
next
does.
week.
Some people call him Canute, but yeah, he is often known as the Great. And I'm excited to get into it. As I said, he's rules for actually no, sorry, not 50 years. He only rules for like 20 or so years, but he also is the King of England, King of Denmark, and King of Norway.
Yeah, which is
So
probably
pretty
someone
cool.
that ruled more countries than most. You know, that's a lot to be ruling. I want to note, as you were mentioning the clothing, so I'm in this group called the History Quill Community about
Hmm.
historical fiction. And we had a medieval historian answer questions last week. So I asked her about how a noblewoman in the late 11th century in northern France would have dressed.
Good to
And
know.
I think it's pretty similar to in England at this time. And she
Yeah.
said the finest imported silk and local imported wools would be available. They would
Wow.
be lavishly embroidered, even with gold or silver threads. Silk was imported from across Asia, but an Italian silk had been developed as well, thanks to Islamic conquest across the Mediterranean. Wool was being produced across Europe, but England was at the forefront of the wool export and trade. And then they would wear a belt on the women would wear a belt on the outside of the dress, and that's where they would hang like keys and pouches, like their purse and stuff would be hanging off this belt on their because they didn't have purses like we have today. And their robe consisted of a tunic with sleeves and a mantle fashioned at the neck, and sometimes a sleeveless surcoat worn between these layers. And then their hair would usually be braided and covered. As you can see in that picture you showed, they're usually covered with a cloth because heaven
Nice.
forbid that a man could see the woman's hair.
Well, I don't know if it was so much that. I think it was more like it was harder to like bathe and shower, so their hair was just a little bit dirtier and stuff. So they're just trying to like,
I don't know about that.
I mean, it's
Anyway, and
really
then
a
they
picture
wore,
of like, because not everyone's doing it. I think it was more of a nobility thing. I
yeah,
don't think
and
it
then
was
the,
like a, but I don't know. I mean, they are covering their whole body. But I
yeah,
don't know. I kind of think that I'd have to look more into it, but I do kind of think the early medieval that we're in right now was actually a little bit more sexually like open than it gets to be like when it gets more and more like when the church gets more and more powerful. I think things get
yeah,
more
agree,
conservative, but I gotta look more into it.
agree.
Anyway, hope you enjoyed this episode about Edmund Ironside. Follow us on Instagram, on YouTube, or on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Leave a 5-star review. Leave a comment anywhere. Ask questions. We are always checking the social media. All right. Until
Thank
next
you.
time.
See
See
you
you
next
later.
time.